So thank you, everybody. Before I get started, I'm going to show you the slide you've probably seen over and over again from anyone presenting from New Relic today. I'm not going to read it to you. You can read it if you want. I'm not going to say anything more about it. But what I want to talk to you today about is security, and basically effective security programs. So as the Chief Information Security Officer at New Relic, I obviously am responsible for making sure that we are protecting all of our systems, our data, our corporate data, our employee data, and probably most importantly, our customer data. And as a leader of a security program, I have a lot of control over how we do this. I have a lot of control over making our program the type of program that I think is appropriate for protecting that data. But there's one area that I don't have a lot of control over, and this is not unique to New Relic or unique to me, and that's the area of our vendors. We, like probably most of you, use a number of SaaS vendors, third parties, to help us conduct our business. And we need to figure out how can we tell if those third parties, if those vendors are actually secure, if they're protecting data the same way we would want to protect it ourselves. Now, the traditional way that people do this is you send out these long checklists, hundreds and hundreds of questions, asking all sorts of minutiae about security. You know, are you doing this? Are you doing that? Are you using this device? That sort of thing. I've sent loads of those out in my career. I've received loads of those during my career. Answer them all the time. The problem is I've come to believe those don't really help me measure how effective a security program is. They'll tell me if you're doing all those things, which is good, but are you really doing them well? Is your program actually effective? And so what I want to talk about today is sort of how I think about this problem, how I like to measure our vendors, and how I like to measure our own security program. Now, one aside, you might be wondering what this slide has to do with security programs. So while I was actually creating this presentation, I was thinking to myself, is there a really good metric I can use for measuring effectiveness of a security program? And I thought, well, could I use like the number of vulnerabilities we have? You know, if you have no open vulnerabilities, though, does that mean that you're really secure, or does it mean you're really bad at finding vulnerabilities? Do we want to use things like breaches? I don't know if I really think that's the best metric. And what I finally realized one day is a point in time where I really felt I had a good, effective security program in place was when I was able to head up to the Sierras, do something I love, which is camping or backpacking for a week off the grid, no phone, and not worry about the security program while I was gone. That's sort of my internal measure and sort of why I put the slide up here. So before, though, I talk about sort of what is an effective program, how I consider it an effective program, I want to talk about what it's not, or why I don't think it is. So first of all, I don't think you make an effective, a good security program just by using checklists. There's loads of checklists you can find on the web from security organizations. Those questionnaires I talked about with the hundreds of questions are great checklists of lots of things you can do. But they don't really tell you if you're secure. The problem with checklists, I mean, they do make sure you're not missing anything, which is important. But the problem in my mind with checklists is checklists only deal with expected problems. They don't deal with the unexpected. If you have an item on the checklist, it's either because a lot of people are doing it, and so everybody else should be doing it, or somewhere along the line, you had some sort of security issue, someone had a security issue, thought, well, if we'd only checked this before this happened, we would have been OK. So they put it on the checklist. But it's not dealing with the unexpected. The other thing that I don't think makes up an effective security program is just going out and buying a lot of services, a lot of appliances. Salespeople might tell you otherwise, but I've seen a lot of these things. I've had a lot of these appliances, used them in the past. And the issue is, in theory, they're always really good at detecting security issues. In practice, what I found over and over again is they require so much care and feeding, so much tuning to actually get actionable results. Most people don't actually get them working well. You end up getting lots of false positives all the time and basically end up ignoring real alerts. So if it's really not about this sort of thing, what do I think is really the best measure? And what I've come to believe is it's basically about what I call a maturity of a security organization. I'll go in a little bit more at what that is. But it's not just the checklist. It's not just the shopping. It's not just the compliance. Those things have a little bit of a role, but it's not solely those. So what I want to do today is really talk about what I consider the maturity and how we measure our vendors. And I really break this down sort of into a few areas here. So when I talk about maturity, I'm talking about things like the maturity of the security team itself, the maturity of the processes you have in place, how well are you integrating with developers, how well do you have processes for provisioning, deprovisioning people, do you have policies in place, what sort of things are you doing around compliance, monitoring, how do you even know if you're secure, how do you know if you have a breach, how do you know if you have vulnerabilities, and then transparency, your willingness to talk about your security program, and then the mindsets, the security mindsets you have within the team and within the company as a whole. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go through each of these a little bit more of a deep dive. And one of the things I'm going to do as I go through is I'm going to share some of the questions we ask our vendors as we go through this. So I did mention before, these checklists, hundreds and hundreds of questions. We don't send those out. I hate receiving those. I'm not going to send them to other people. What we have actually is a checklist, not even a checklist, a list of about 22 open-ended essay questions that we use to evaluate our vendors. So as we go through these, I'm also going to share some of those questions. So let's start with a team. What do I mean by a team? When I talk about the maturity of the team, I'm talking about the size of the team. Do you actually have dedicated security people? Or do you just have someone whose day job or part-time job is to do security? How big is that team? What is the background of those people on the team? I also look at the type of people you have. Is a team composed of sort of old school security people who are very risk adverse, always saying no? Or do you have more modern thinking security people who are actually working with the business, enabling things like that? And so that's sort of the type of stuff we look for in the team. How mature is that team? And this will give you an idea of some of the questions that we talk about. I'm not going to read through all these questions, but you can see these are sort of open-ended essay questions. And by the way, if anybody wants to mail me later, I'm happy to share our list of questions. Maybe some of you are our vendors and you've already seen these before. But you can see it's really just open-ended, and how you answer these tells us almost more than actually what you answer. I can tell if it's a salesperson answering the question or a security person who really understands what they're doing. Another area of maturity we talk about is processes. So do you have formal documented processes, or is it ad hoc? Can you have repeatable processes? How well are you integrating into the development team? So when developers have something new, do they have to come to you as a security team and say, hey, I want you to look at this? Or do you actually have formal ways of making sure that you they get checked off, that you've actually looked at what they're doing? Processes around access. So who's allowed to access data? How are they provisioned? How are they deprovisioned? So you can see some of the questions here. These are good. Second and fourth, I think, are pretty good examples of very open-ended questions. And you can see I'm not just saying, do it this way, check this box if you're doing this. I'm saying, tell me how you do it. I'm not telling you the right way to do it. I'm just asking you how you do it, and then I can evaluate. Policies is another area of maturity we look at. Now, policies don't necessarily make for good security in and of themselves. I mean, it's very easy to go out and find some generic policies and just say, these are our policies, and actually not follow any of them. But generally what I found is by the time you start thinking maybe we need some security policies as a company, you started to think about security. And so that helps us, once again, it's an indicator of how mature you're getting. Quite a few questions in this area. Of interest here probably are the questions around classification. So do you actually understand the data that you have? Do you classify and look at different types of data as different levels of sensitivity? That shows you're starting to think about security, starting to think about customer data. The questions around who has access, that's also a very mature problem. Generally, when you're a small company, a little startup, pretty much everybody has access to data. Everyone has production access. But as you start getting larger, you start realizing that's not a great idea. We have to start putting controls in place around who can access data. I like to talk about compliance, too. So I certainly am not one of these people who are going to say you're going to be secure by being compliant. But actually, I'd sort of almost think about it the other way, is that a lot of these compliance things, like we do a SOC 2 audit of ourselves. We're now starting to look at FedRAMP. Some of you might be doing other things, HIPAA, whatever it might be. These compliance regimes are not easy. You can't just go into this and assume you're going to be compliant without doing any work beforehand. So I found that if people have done a lot of compliance work, it's generally a good indication they have that security program in place to start with. Don't ask a huge amount of questions here, but I like this one. It's just, do you even understand what you should be compliant to? And you'd be surprised at some of the very small vendors I've gotten answers back here who just didn't even understand their compliance obligations. Monitoring is also a really important one for me, is do you know if you've actually been breached? Do you know what vulnerabilities you have? Are you monitoring continuously every day for vulnerabilities, something like we do? Or are you just scanning once a year, once a month, something like that? Do you have scanning integrated into the developer's lifecycle? Are you scanning code as they check it in? Or are you just scanning their front-end website? So we ask a few questions around these. I love this second question. The second question is actually probably my favorite question in this whole thing, and you'd be surprised at the sort of answers I get back. How would you know if you had actually been breached? I've had people come back saying, our customers would tell us if we saw something. But this is a question that I can actually tell almost more than any other question how sophisticated the security team is. I want to talk about transparency a little bit. So transparency to me is important and a sign of maturity because transparency comes from comfort. If you don't have a good security program, if you think I've got lots of gaps, you're not going to want to talk about your security program. If I ask you questions about how secure you are, you're going to try and talk around those questions. If you, however, have a good security program and you're proud of it, you're willing to be open. You're willing to talk about what you're doing, how you're doing it, show your assessment results, show your audit results. This is something, we actually went as far as, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the Cloud Security Alliance, but they're an organization, and they actually allow you to do a sort of self-assessment of your security and post it to their website. And we go ahead and post ours there because we're transparent. We believe in the security story. We're happy to share that. The next area, so questions around transparency. We don't have a lot of those, but basically this one gets to, are you willing to share your assessment results? And that tells us a lot. The last area I talk about around maturity, and perhaps it's the hardest to measure, but perhaps the most important, is the area of mindset. When I talk about mindset, I'm sort of talking about two areas. The first area of mindset I'm talking about is sort of the mindset of the company as a whole. How well does everybody who works in your company understand your compliance obligations, understand how you need to keep data secure, understand why you need to keep data secure? But even more, perhaps, or at least equally as important as the mindset of the company as a whole, is the mindset within the security organization. And this is something I'm really big on, so I'm going to actually show a few slides here. But I believe it's really important to have a mindset around being pragmatic about security, as opposed to sort of checklist security. The checklist security we talk about, where you just have all these things and you do it, doesn't necessarily make you secure. Pragmatic security is what I believe makes you secure. And let me talk a little bit about that. So part of being pragmatic is always understanding that we are running a business. We are in the business of creating product, of selling product, of making money so we can return profit to our investors, pay our employees. As a security team, we could always be saying, no, you can't release that feature because it's not secure. Or saying, we could even take our servers off the internet if we wanted, make them really secure. But that would impact our bottom line. We always have to remember we have to run a business. The other issue that plays into this and being pragmatic is always remembering that your company is made up of real people. And real people are not always rational. They don't do what you expect. They sometimes do stupid things. Real people don't like blindly following checklists. Real people don't like doing things just because you told them so without giving them good reasons. And I talk about this because the way we like to think about security within our team, and the way I like to see this play out in other companies, is to always remember that you're solving for security for the long term. You're not solving for security just for the next few moments, just for the next few months. This means that we actually, as a security team, have to build relationships with those people that I talked about. We have to engage them. We have to make them actually want to work with us so that they want to come back to us, so they don't ignore us in the future. This sometimes means we're going to have to make extra effort. It sometimes means we're going to have to go out of our way to help them find alternatives to no. But this is important because if we were the type of security team that always said no, that always said you have to do these 10 things just because the textbook says you have to do them, what would happen is in the short term, we'd probably be more secure. In the long term, people would hate us. People would not want to deal with us. They'd start ignoring us. They wouldn't be coming to us when they see security issues. They wouldn't be coming to us when they have new products. And as a result, in the long term, we'd actually be much less secure. There's another way I actually like to view this. I love talking about this within my team, is we manage our capital. We manage our personal and team capital. That is how we make things happen, and it's how we ultimately make the company more secure. We build capital up in our team every time we have some sort of good interaction with developers or somebody in the company. We build capital every time we're transparent, every time we help people figure out alternatives to no, anytime we make what's sort of traditionally a painful security process much less painless. On the other hand, we lose capital every time we say no, particularly if we're not transparent about why we're saying no. We lose capital every time we make somebody do something they didn't want to do, follow some painful process, have rework, that sort of thing. And the issue is, there's times when we really do have things where we need to say no to, or times where we really have to drive change within the company. And if we haven't saved up enough capital at that point, we're going to have a really hard time making those things happen. We need that capital to spend it when we really need it. And the interesting thing about this, too, is I find it makes us very judicious about when we say no. I mentioned that the mindset stuff is sort of hard to measure, so we don't have a lot of questions that directly deal with that. This one question just deals with the company-wide, but really it's the answers and the way you answer all those other questions that actually tells me a lot about the mindset you have within the security team. So those are sort of all the things I look at for maturity. But what do we do with that data? So we had all these questions, we send them out. How do we actually measure this and apply this? So I'm not sure how many of you have ever seen this before. This is called a learning matrix. And the idea here, this is how people generally learn skills. And so the way it works is when you're starting to learn something new, maybe tennis, a language, chess, whatever it might be, you usually start in this top left quadrant. And the idea there is that you are unconsciously incompetent. You are bad at something, you don't even know you're bad at it because you don't know what good looks like. Then generally at some point, you're going to move down to that bottom left. Now you're consciously incompetent. You're still bad at it, but at least you understand you're bad at it. You know what good looks like. You know the path forward. You know where you need to go. From there, you're generally going to move to consciously competent, which means that you're actually getting pretty good at something. You still have to think about it. So in your tennis swing, you're thinking it through as you make the swing. But you're still pretty good. And eventually, you're going to move into that top right quadrant. That's the muscle memory. That's where you don't even have to think anymore. You're just good at something because you've been doing it so long. So we took this, and we made this our security maturity matrix. And we can actually map people to these various quadrants based on their answers. And we map ourselves to this, too. So just so you can look at some of these. So if you're in that top left quadrant, that's usually the brand new companies. A startup. You don't have any sort of security team. You do lots of hand waving when someone talks to you about security. So usually, if I talk to one of these companies about security and say, how do I know you're secure? They'll be, we use SSL and we're in a secure data center. Well, great, so is every other company in the world. That doesn't tell me anything. That's hand waving. You don't have any formal processes, no policies in place. You have no idea even what you need to be compliant, and there's no security mindset. So from there, what generally is going to happen is you're going to move to that next quadrant. And you move to that next quadrant when one of two things usually happens. Either you have a security incident. Hopefully, that's not the way you move there. Or normally, what's going to happen is you're going to start selling more of your product. You're going to get more larger companies that start actually asking about your security. And you think, this is actually important. We need to do something about this. So at that point, you're now starting to, designate or delegate somebody, this is your security part-time. Maybe you don't have anyone full-time security yet, but you at least have somebody who's responsible for security. You're starting to understand the issues you might have. You haven't maybe addressed all your security issues, but you at least understand them. You've now got ad hoc processes in place, maybe not repeatable, maybe you haven't documented it, but you're starting to do things over and over again. You're starting to become aware of where you might need to be compliant, and you're starting to follow sort of what I call the checklist security. You're doing all these things because the textbook says you should do them, which is still better than not doing things. From there, you're generally going to move over to this right side. Now, this is where you actually start getting dedicated security people with security in their job title. You're starting to document all your processes. You're starting to become compliant. Maybe you haven't been audited yet, but you're at least going through those compliance regimes. You're doing a lot more monitoring. And now you're in this area of pragmatic security. And from there, eventually, you move over to this unconscious competence. This is where you have your large security teams, formal security reviews, lots of monitoring. You're compliant with whatever you need to be compliant. And as a company, you've got that security mindset. So this is sort of, once again, how we measure our vendors. We can take those questions, and we have some checklists we use to actually bucket people into these various buckets. And then what do we do with this information? We actually say, we can take this and figure out what we can do with companies based on this. Now, there's always some flexibility in here, but generally, this is the way it works. If you're in that top left quadrant, we probably don't want to use you. Maybe if you want to use it for personal stuff at home, that's fine, but as a company, we're probably not ready to use you. If you're in that lower left, we're still probably not ready to use you for any sort of business-related things. But if we want to do something like sending out invitations to the company picnics, probably acceptable use there. But it's really, you have to be on that right side for us to want to use you for serious business purposes. So that bottom right is sort of where we're now comfortable actually sending you customer data, PII, that sort of thing. And only the companies that are in that very top right corner are the ones we're comfortable sending regulated data, credit cards, social security numbers, that sort of thing. And so I want to actually wrap up by going back to that matrix again one more time, because I do want to emphasize that this isn't just what we do for our vendors. This is how we measure our own security program. We want to drive ourselves through the same process and always use this as our target. And because I know somebody will probably ask me, when I joined the company, I would say that was about 3.5 years ago, we were probably somewhere between those two left buckets. We had not done a lot with security, but we'd started to realize that security was important, that we needed to start building a team, which was why I was hired. And I've basically spent the past 3.5 years sort of walking us through this whole matrix to the point now where if I had to place us, we'd probably be sort of consider us, and I'm biased, but probably the lower part of this top right quadrant, where we've done a lot of compliance work. We do SOC 2. We've got formal processes, formal reviews in place. We're still a fairly small security team. There's only 7 of us right now, so we don't have that huge team. But I think, I always like to think, if we use this as our map, we always have room for improvement. We should always be driving ourselves through. And so with that, I'd like to wrap up. It does look like we have a few minutes. I'm happy to answer any questions, a couple questions if anybody has any. If not, I'd like to thank you all for your time. So thank you.